One of the first things to do when you turn up to a new swim you're not familiar with is try and work out exactly where to place your hook baits. Sometimes that can be quite obvious by the actual features above the surface of the water in your swim. For instance, you may have large rush beds or overhanging trees, but generally, more often than not, your actual features are well under the water's surface and can only be identified by the use of a feature finding setup. The venue I'm fishing today is Lord's Farm Fishery down in the Fens. Now, this water is extremely different to a lot of others you might have fished, in the fact this one's a man-made reservoir and goes down to around 25 foot deep in the middle. There's a lot of natural food in here, a lot of weed, and to be honest with you, even though the depths are pretty uniform, by using the feature finding setup you can actually pick out different variations in the bottom, from silt to harder spots, places where you might think the carp are feeding over. To identify these is very simple. What I'm using is an Aero Carp Marker rod, teamed up with an Aerlex Spod reel and 30-pound Power Pro braid. This setup can either be used with a marker float to help you gauge the actual depth, or you could also just use it with a straight lead. At the end of the day, it's completely up to you, and depending on how many fish you think you've got in front of you, there's nothing worse than turning up at a venue and just starting to bombard the fish with leads. Sometimes it can be a lot better just to clip on a small lead and just make a couple of exploratory casts just to see what you've got in front of you. Sometimes though, it can be a good idea to clip a marker float on, just to see what the depth variations are like in your swim. You can cast it out, count it up to the surface, retrieve it a couple of yards, and repeat the process all the way back to the bank to help you map out your swim. Now, that's also really helpful as well if you want to do any spotting, because you can work out where your spot is, allow the float to go all the way to the surface, and then use that as a marker to feed and also clip up to. One thing to bear in mind sometimes, if you're fishing a water which has got a lot of pike in it, if you're retrieving these floats along the surface, the pike can sometimes actually hit them. Now, what I've found a lot of the time in the past is when using hollow floats like this, if they get hit, the pike can actually leave teeth marks in them, which actually makes them sink. In them situations, if you do think you've got pike out in front of you, it can be worth using sort of balsa wood floats. Even an actual balsa wood pike float is a good way around it. The Aero Carp Marker rod has been specifically designed just for this purpose of locating spots out in the lake. And it's got a very sensitive tip to help you actually tell the difference between gravel, weed, silt, and when paired up with braid, it really exaggerates what you've got out in front of you. If you haven't done any feature finding before, it'd be well worth you trying to get to grips with it. A setup like this doesn't cost the earth, but what it will do is give you a much better insight to the underwater world in front of you. And it should, in theory, help you put a lot more fish on the bank.